surprised to see me here, you're absolutely right. As you know me, I hate being here in this table, and I'm only here because it's Ron and Nancy, and I love them very dearly. They have been wonderful to us over the years, and it's very special to have them here today. I'm also here because Francisco forced me to, and obviously he says all the nice things first, and then he leaves me absolutely nothing to say. So I'm not taking up much of your time, and then he corrects me when I don't use this technology properly. I'm not going to take much of your time, and I'm going to do what it's usually the presentation of Ron Rohner. And he is the creator of part theory, and it is, as Francisco said, a theory that has changed our lives, and I'm not trying to make a big deal out of it. It's simply as it is. He is executive director of ISIPAR, and he has been distinguished both by the American Psychology Association as well as having received the Outstanding International Psychologist Award in 2008. When I give these statements, I always feel I'm robbing the person of its value, and I think Ron is so much more than this. It's wonderful to have him here. I know I am enjoying these days very, very much, and I hope you will enjoy this conference as well. So welcome, and especially welcome Ron, and welcome Nancy, and thank you for being here.
And today I want to share some of this love with you. I'm going to talk about on a topic that you already know a great deal about, because I'm going to be talking about you. And so I want to invite you to think about everything that I say and relate it to yourself. Relate it to the people that you know, the people that you care about. We've been working for half a century now on issues of parental acceptance rejection. We've worked with well over 100,000 people on every continent of our planet except for the Antarctic. We don't know what to do with the penguins in the Antarctic, and there are no native populations down there, so they have to be left out. And over the course of doing this work, we have learned some fundamental lessons, two of them, two basic lessons. But before I get into those lessons and you think about yourself, I want to just give you an overview of what parental acceptance rejection is, or parental acceptance rejection theory is. It's divided into, it's a lifespan, it's an evidence-based theory of lifespan development and socialization. And it asks 5 classes of questions that are divided into 3 sub-theories. And this morning I'm going to focus primarily on the one that's up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen there, personality sub-theory. It takes me, in American universities, our semesters last 14 weeks. And it takes me 14 weeks to go through the entirety of PAR theory. I'm going to try to give you a snapshot of it this morning in about an hour. So you can see that I'm going to be leaving out a fair amount of information regarding the theory itself, the methods that we use, the evidence that bears on it, and so forth. But I hope that I'm able to give you the essentials of it. And in fact, as I'm going to mention in a moment, I can summarize what we've learned in the past 50 years in about 5 minutes. And then those of you who have urgent things that you have to do, if after 5 minutes you have learned the bottom line, the lessons that I have for you, the bottom line message, then feel free to leave. But if you want to get more information about, where these conclusions come from, then I invite you to stay for a while longer. So there are 5 questions, or 5 classes of questions that we ask in, I'm going to call it PAR theory, parental acceptance rejection theory. One of them that has to do, in personality subtheory, what happens to people, what happens to children who experience themselves to be cared about or not by the people that are most important to them in their lives, and those people are usually parents. Basically we're asking, is it true that children every place on our planet, regardless of differences of race, language, gender, culture, and other kinds of defining conditions, are we wired as human beings to understand ourselves to be cared about in the same way? The answer is yes. Cared about or not cared about by the people that are most important to us. And do we tend to respond in the same way? The answer to that question is also yes. Those are the 2 bottom line messages that I want you to walk away with this morning. But another question that we ask, or started asking back in the 1970s and 60s, has to do with, do the effects of rejection or acceptance extend from childhood into adulthood? Is it in fact a lifetime issue that relates to what we become as human beings? And again, the answer there is yes. So I'm going to spend most of my time trying to give you some details about how this actually works. And I want you to, as I say, I want you to think about yourself. To what extent are the things that I'm saying true for you? Because in everything I say, you should be able to find yourself someplace. But another portion of PAR theory is what we call coping subtheory. And that is, even though we have learned that people every place in the world tend to respond exactly the way that personality subtheory predicts, there are a few individuals that don't. And these individuals seem to be people that are able, have the resilience in some way to stand up to the corrosive drizzle of day-to-day hostility, aggression, indifference, neglect, whatever the expression of rejection might be by the people that are important to them, their attachment figures, parents as children, teachers, intimate adult partners. They don't respond in exactly the same way. They hurt, but they don't hurt to the same degree that most of us do. And we're interested in trying to find out who these people are and what gives them the resilience to stand up to the effects of rejection without hurting, without buckling, without having their psychological adjustment impaired to the same extent that most of us are. Because if we can take that information, if we can find out what those things are, then we might be able to help people that are not doing as well with their struggle to deal with the issues of acceptance rejection. In most populations, in fact, in just about every population that we've worked with in the United States and Europe, ethnic groups in America and in Europe, we find that somewhere on the range of 7 to 10% of every audience that I've talked to, or every sample that we've worked with of children and adults, about 7 to 10% of those people experience themselves to be qualitatively more rejected than accepted by their parents, mothers and or fathers, or intimate partners and others. So in this room, I'm guessing that there may be something on the order of 100, 150 people. So somewhere I'm talking especially to at least 15 of you who are going to find yourself on the hurt end of what I'm talking about more than perhaps the rest of us. On the positive side, if you say 7 to 10% experience significant rejection, that means on the whole, most people are doing pretty well in their lives, in relationships. But not everybody. And we've all experienced rejection of some kind to some degree, even if it's nothing more than being ignored in a social context where we think that people should be, where we should be interacting with them, or they should be paying some attention to us. Spurned, ignored, and so forth. Well, some of us deal more effectively than others with this, and that's part of what we're dealing with in coping subtheory. The issue, and I'll come back to that very briefly a little bit later on. The third sub-theory of PAR theory, sociocultural systems model and sub-theory, is one that I'm really not going to have time to talk about today at all, but it has some fascinating implications. One of them is fairly obvious, and that is, why are some parents warm and loving toward their children and other parents not? Are there conditions under which parents are likely to, that are good predictive of parents being loving or not toward their children? At this point in time, by the way, I'm going to focus a lot on just parent-child relationships, but you'll see a little bit later I'm going to go into intimate adult relationships. And there's some obvious things, like the single-parent household, where a parent, mother or father, but more often than not it would be a mother, is in isolation with one or more children, social isolation, without social supports. These are universally families that are at risk for the love withdrawal, for some degree of rejection. So yes, there are some conditions under which it's universally the case that children are at greater risk than others. That part we all know about pretty much, but perhaps what you don't know is that the experience of being loved or not loved, and it's not a matter of being either or, by the way, as we'll see in just a moment here, it's a matter of a continuum. We're all more or less loved. We feel more or less loved by the people that are most important to us. We fall somewhere along a dimension, continuum. You may find today, by the way, that I falter a little bit from time to time because I got about 4 or 5 hours sleep last night, and my head doesn't always work as well as I like it to when I'm feeling sleep deprived. So just bear with me because you're going to get the story. It just might be a little less fluent than I like it to be when I'm talking. So. Because that, by the way, was a digression deliberately because I lost my train of thought for a moment. Now I'm back to it. That one of the techniques that professors sometimes have, to keep going. One of the less obvious things about the effects of rejection is that about 75%, or I'll put it the other way around, about 25% of the societies of the world, parents in 25% of the societies of the world tend to behave in ways that we call rejection. These are normative, the good, the proper way that parents believe they should behave toward their children. But it's hurtful nonetheless. And the question is, even in those societies where they believe that they're doing normatively correct, the right thing to their children, do those children respond the way that the theory predicts? Do those adults who had themselves experienced these things when they were children respond as the theory predicts? And the answer, by the way, again, is yes, they do. Doesn't make any difference if it's normative in a society or not. So in those societies where children are raised in a way that we would call a form of rejection, their supernatural world, whatever it might be, if they believe in, whatever their nature of God is, whatever the beliefs about God, and in most societies around the world, people have some sort of beliefs about a personal God or supernatural in some way. In those societies, God tends to be viewed as being more malevolent, hostile, aggressive, capable of bringing crop failure, infertility, other kinds of unhappy things into the lives of people. Whereas in societies where children are accepted, raised with love, feel that they're raised with love and caring, their supernatural world tends to be viewed as being benevolent. We have also discovered that within a society, there's variation. So, for example, I can't speak to Spain to Portugal on this per se, because no one yet has done this study in Portugal that I'm aware of. But in every other country where we've done this, we find out not everybody believes in God. But those people who do believe in God, regardless of what their scriptures may say, in Catholicism or Judaism or Islam or whatnot, regardless of what their scriptures may say, we have our own personal views, feelings about what God is like. And those people who are raised in rejecting families, or feel that they had been as adults rejected as children, tend to do exactly the same thing that I just described. They tend to view God as being less benevolent than children who are raised in loving families. We all have feelings about art. We like certain kinds of art and we don't like other kinds of art as much. But it's no accident, it turns out, that the kind of art that we like is related to these life experiences. And it goes on and on and on. These symbolic kinds of things are what we call in PAR theory expressive behaviors. They express things that go on inside of us that we're not even aware of very often, that will sometimes spin out into and change the fabric of what a society is like. Well, I can't go much further on this issue because I want to come back to the topic of the psychological adjustment and the things that we deal with in personality sub-theory. But I just want you to know that PAR theory extends out. The evidence that we've been able to develop in the past 50 years suggests that there is no other experience in life that I personally, at least, have been able to study in my reading of psychology and the social sciences in the past 50 years that has as consistent and wide and deep effects on us as people, every place on our planet, as the experience of being cared about does, or not cared about. It has more impact developmentally on us than any other class of experience that I know anything about. And we've been reading widely for many decades now on this. So it's shaped your life and it shaped mine. Now I want to tell you a little bit more about how all of this comes about and some of the things that you may be experiencing in yourself. Let's see, where are we? Okay, I started out saying that there are two lessons that we've learned. One of them is that human beings every place understand themselves to be cared about in exactly the same way. We have not yet found any population of the world, whether it be tribal groups of Africa, out in East Asia, in Portugal, the United States, wherever, where this has not been true. I'm going to come to that point. I'm going to show you what those ways are. There are 4 classes of behaviors that we all understand that shape our feelings about being cared about. And we all tend to respond in exactly the same way. There's a specific cluster of things that start to happen to us when we experience ourselves to be cared about or not. There's specific 7 to 10 things, a little ball of things that begin to happen, that they interrelate among themselves. You'll find yourself in this. Okay. The warmth dimension. The warmth dimension of parenting, the warmth dimension of interpersonal relationships. Think of this now. I invite you to think, think about somebody who's very important in your life. Think about your mother, your father, if you want to go back to childhood. Think about your intimate partner. Somebody who's been very influential in your life. Place yourself along this dimension, but that has to be for the purposes of what we're talking about now. Let me focus primarily on parent-child relationships, because there's just so much that I can say, and it varies depending on the kind of relationship that we deal with. So let me say think about what you experienced when you were a kid growing up with your mother or father, whoever is really very important to you. It turns out that humans, every place in the world so far, and I always emphasize so far because it's possible that we'll find a population someplace in the world that doesn't respond this way, but so far everybody understands themselves that in relationships, how warm and affectionate is my partner or my parent toward me. And this can be expressed physically, as you see on the slide, verbally, as you see on the slide, or it can be expressed purely symbolically, having neither a physical nor a verbal manifestation. And one of my favorite illustrations of this is an incident that occurred when I was working in a caste stratified community in Bengal, India, West Bengal as it was called then. And I was interviewing with my Bengali interpreter and cultural mentor, you might say. I was interviewing a mother about sitting on the veranda in a high caste family and interviewing about her child. But I noticed on the veranda sitting beside me, just a few paces down, was another mother who was sitting there, and she was impassively, she wasn't saying anything, but I just caught my attention a little bit that she was peeling an orange, and then she segmented this orange, and then she pulled the seeds out of the orange segments, and then one segment at a time, she put it in her daughter's mouth. The daughter was probably 10 or 11, 12, it was hard to tell exactly. And as this went on, I could see that her daughter was becoming more and more kind of excited about this. And when my interview was over, my guide, Dr. Manjusi Chaki Sarkar, asked me, "Did you notice what was going on beside you?" I said, "Yeah, sort of. I mean, you know." She said, "That's what you should pay attention to. That's why you came here. You came here to study issues of parental acceptance and rejection. And what you saw was a classic," she didn't use the word classic, "illustration of a mother's love. Because those women, those mothers, the young mothers, work from before the first light in the day, and they are worked hard all day long. Not only do I get tired, sleep deprived, but I guess I get spastic. They work all day long and until after dark. They don't have time to sit on a veranda and peel an orange and segment an orange and take the seeds out of an orange and feed their child segment by segment. So every Bengali child knows that if mother does that, she's done something very special. It's a special expression of love, symbolically. And that really caught my attention, because if I were to do that with my son, I had my children with me, they were young at the time, and if I were to do that with my son or my daughter, it would say, "Dad, I don't really want an orange, thanks." You know, it would have no meaning for them. So it's cultural meaning, the cultural expressions of these things. But people every place in the world, in some way, verbally, physically, symbolically, understand warmth and affection, expressions of it. As you saw in this great display out front there that Francisco and Marcia put together of different expressions of acceptance here in the Porto area. But on the other side of it is coldness, lack of affection. These are expressions of rejection. How how cold and unaffectionate is your partner or is your parent, or you perceive your partner or parent to be? How hostile and aggressive do you perceive your partner or your parent to be? How indifferent or neglecting do you perceive that person to be? How, and this one, these others have physical manifestations in some way. You can see them and you can hear them, you can do something with them. But the fourth form of rejection is purely interpretive. Through your eyes, through your feelings about the quality of the relationship between yourself and that very powerful person in your life. And it's called undifferentiated rejection. And that is the feeling, without necessarily having any objective indicators that the parent is aggressive or indifferent or neglecting toward you, but the feeling that your parent, your mother, your father, or your partner, whoever, the teacher, doesn't really like you, doesn't really appreciate you, doesn't want you, generally doesn't love you in some way. I use the word love here just generically for these issues. And we all have feelings about that. To what extent it's true or not true in our primary relationships with people, our attachment figures. All right, so here's now your assignment. You've placed yourself somewhere along this dimension, I hope, more or less in relationship to some very important person in your life. Now, depending on where you fall on that, from experiencing feeling like there was great love or not love. And notice, by the way, I'm always talking about your feelings and your perceptions. Because what governs your life and my life isn't what somebody else says goes on in our lives. Isn't what somebody else says is the true nature of that relationship. It's what you and I feel about that relationship. Our perception of it, our feelings about it. Our lives are governed by our feelings and perceptions of the nature, the quality of the relationship between ourselves and the people that are most important to us. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference what somebody else says about that relationship if it's not true, if you don't feel it yourself, within yourself. Okay, now, unfortunately, because again, in an hour's time I can only do so much, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus mostly on the effects of rejection. Even though I don't like to do that, I would much rather talk about love. I'd much prefer being a guy who hugs than hurts. That's just me. It's my wife. And obviously, by the way, I should say it's also true of Francisco and Marcia, as we've come to learn in the past couple of days. I mean, and so many of you, it's just wonderful. All right, but there is the reality of hurt, really deep hurt. And as I'm going to point out to you in a few minutes, it isn't just a matter of subjective feelings, it also goes into the very nature of the brain structure and so forth. But I'm getting ahead of my story on that one. There are at least 7 effects of the rejection process. Universal. We have not found any country, nation, ethnic group, language, gender, whatever, yet, I always have to say yet, that where people do not respond exactly the way the theory predicts. One of the first things that begins to happen with the experience of rejection is anger, hostility, aggression, passive aggression, problems with the management of hostility and aggression, aggressive daydreams, aggressive night dreams, an excessive interest in violence, violent movies, and whatever. Because we all have this very powerful need, recognized or unrecognized, and some people deny the need within themselves, and I'll talk about those people in a few minutes. We all have a fundamental need to be cared about, for nurturance, for support, for caring, whatever term you want to use, or terms you want to use, I'll call it simply love. And when we don't get those needs met, or not met sufficiently, we tend to respond in the same way. It's wired into us as human beings, it seems, to respond in a consistent way. The fascinating thing for me that I started doing this when I was a graduate student, and every study that I did and since then came basically to the same conclusion. And I said, this is clearly something that is wired into us as human beings over the course probably of biological, biocultural evolution. We are a species of animal that needs positive response. We thrive on it, but we do the opposite when we don't get those needs met. All right, anger. We start feeling badly about ourselves, impaired self-esteem. We begin to think that, gee, I'm not very competent. I'm not capable of managing the kinds of problems that I have to manage at the day-to-day level because I can't do anything about changing this relationship. So not only am I not a very good person, but I'm not very good at it, at whatever the at might be. Impaired self-adequacy. With the hurt of rejection, the pain of rejection, people often start to close off emotionally. They create a barrier between themselves and other people to some degree. They can be very friendly, but they'll let people get only so close to them, and then they'll drop the wall down emotionally. It's too scary. So those of you, by the way, who are going to become therapists or social workers or working with kids in the courts or teachers, whatever, if you're working with, you've got to keep these things in mind. These are normal, natural responses that human beings make to the rejection process. They're not easy to deal with, but they're entirely expectable and entirely normal responses. Then emotional instability, especially for children who are growing up. They don't have the internal resources yet to deal with rejection, with dealing with the fact that their needs are not being met sufficiently. And so they tend to become less stable emotionally. Now think about yourself now. For example, you go out, you have an appointment or class, and you've got 15 minutes to get there, and it's going to start in 15 minutes, and it takes you 15 minutes to get there. You're in your car, you turn the key, and nothing happens. The battery's dead. What do you do? How do you respond emotionally to that? Some people become very upset, cry, get angry, and I see some nodding heads out there, so you recognize that these kinds of things can happen in your life. Other people are much more philosophical about it. Whatever, the capacity to deal with distress without becoming unduly upset. Rejected children really don't have that capacity well formed. We'll all get upset if there's strong enough pressure put on us. So we're talking about more day-to-day kinds of things. And then because of the hurt, the pain that goes into the experiences of rejection, we start thinking, and these very powerful people called mother and dad, and that's the world that we know best as children. Then we start thinking, well, this must be what the world is like. It's not safe. It's insecure. There's hostility. There's hurt. Negative worldview, whatever the expression that might be. And the expression is going to be highly variable from child to child, but it's going to be negative. More negative than positive. And by the way, this is probably why we find that rejected people who believe in God tend to view God as being more malevolent, more hurtful, more angry, capable of bringing unhappy things, or at least not bringing nice things into your life. Because it's a simple extension of your views about what the world is like, worldview, negative worldview, to simply make the attribution that God is that way. And that's the nature of the world. Whereas kids who are raised with love know in their hearts that it's safe, it's secure. Now, they may know, in fact, that it's not safe to be out on the streets because there's some people out there that are not very nice. That's not exactly the same thing as worldview. It's not the general notion, the attribution of the overall world as being the experience of life itself as being safe, secure, or the contrary. Now, everything that I've said up to this point, all of these things are linear. That is, the more rejected a child experiences herself or himself to be, the more angry they tend to be, the more impaired their self-esteem tends to be, and so on. But the only one that is not linear is dependence. And that one is very much curvilinear. And we know, by the way, this is of the 7 things that were in this slide that I just showed you, this is the one that we're least confident about. All the others we have this massive evidence works the way that the theory predicts. This one is complicated. It goes back in part to, part of the issue is that the concept of dependence is very problematic. Many of us don't like, if you call somebody a dependent person, or if you mention something about an individual's dependency, basically you've said something negative about that person. But that is wrong. That's completely wrong, because the normal, healthy person is a person who is capable of reaching out to other people for support, for love, whatever the expression this might be, and that's part of what dependency is all about. So with the rejected child, however, the more rejecting the parent is perceived as being, very often the children will make more and more bids for positive response. Mommy, hold me. Mommy, pick me up. Mommy, love me. Mommy, daddy, whatever. But only up to a point. And that point varies from individual to individual. After a while, it hurts too much to keep trying. So there's the anger stuff that shows up, but they may or may not be allowed to express their anger, or they may feel that it's not proper to express their anger. There's some gender differences in here. And they tend to close their emotions off, wrap them up in cotton, as it were. Now, I'm talking about some of us in this room, by the way. I know that. I don't know who you are, but I know you're here. There's a kind of a fear of intimacy. So what happens is it looks like, as rejection goes out more and more, it looks like they become independent. But in fact, it's not a normal, healthy independence. See, independence for us has to do with emotions. It's the emotional dependence or emotional independence. We're not talking about self-reliance here. So don't confuse independence with self-reliance. They're very different phenomena. They don't deal with the same. Self-reliance has to do more with instrumental activities. Dependency has to do with emotional kinds of things, in par theory. This is the way that it's construed in par theory. So, in order to protect themselves from more hurt, the rejected child and the adult who had been rejected tends to withdraw, to close off emotionally from other people. So many of you, I'm sure, have been in relationships with another person where that, as I mentioned a little while ago, where that person will let you get, you feel like you're really making progress in a relationship, and that relationship is something that you want. And then, for some reason, that person will do something to sort of wreck the relationship. Well, the odds are that that's an expression of defensive independence. That's a way the individual, it's scary. It's too scary to take a chance on being hurt again. So just remember, these are normal, natural, expectable consequences of the rejection process. You've got to remember that. Don't pathologize this. Now, these are the things that we started out with, these 7. We know a great deal about them, although, as I say, and I'm not going to go, by the way, into immature dependence. It's something that we don't know very much about, and it's a minor issue, and so I'll just excuse myself, as it were, from dealing with it, because we don't have time to go into. That's part of my 14 weeks. I'll go into that, but not in an hour. These things we know about. These things we have well over 100,000 people all over the world. And we find that so far there are no exceptions where people generally tend to respond exactly the way the theory predicts. Take that message with you when you work with people that in your professional lives, and take that message with you when you interact with people that are important to you emotionally in your own personal life. Then we realized some years later that the list of things that we had was incomplete. That in fact, along with the anger and so forth, bingo, right off the bat, when you're and now we're getting a little bit closer to some of the things that start to happen in adult relationships. You're in a love relationship that starts going bad, and you really want that person that you are crazy about in your life, and it's going bad. Well, the first thing that's going to start happening to you, in all likelihood, is you're going to get anxious, and you're going to start feeling insecure. And with children, and by the way, we don't have the same, I'm putting this in a separate slide because we don't have the same level of evidence yet. And as I mentioned when we first started, PAR theory is an evidence-based theory. If there's no evidence about it, we drop it. If we can't find evidence that supports it. So far that hasn't happened, but that's our goal, that's our objective, that's the nature of the theory. It's an evidence-based theory of lifespan development, socialization. Well, cognitive distortions. Some of you are familiar with the notion of rejection sensitivity. Rejection sensitivity is a form of cognitive distortion. You're hypervigilant. The rejected person very often is hypervigilant. You're looking for any sign that your relationship with your partner might not be trustworthy, that your partner might do something hurtful. You're watchful. Now, not intentionally, and not even consciously, but there's an awareness of this and a hypersensitivity to it. If something can possibly be interpreted as rejection, if some ambiguity, some ambiguous statement, something goes on that isn't absolutely clear that it means support or caring, if it's not clear, then it's clearly an expression of rejection in the mind, in the heart of the person who had been rejected, who felt rejected as a kid in other relationships. And again, one of my favorite illustrations of this was many, many years ago. I was on a Sunday morning after my family had finished its chores around the house and done some other things. We went off to a local ice cream parlor. And we were sitting in a booth eating our ice cream, and a group of boys who had just finished a soccer game came in and stood in line to get their ice cream. And another boy was late in coming in, so he rushed in, and on the floor was a carpet that was rumpled slightly, and he tripped on it, and he fell forward, and he hit the boy in front of him. And the boy in front of him whirled around, he lashed out at him verbally, and was about ready to hit him, because that boy knew that the boy behind him deliberately hit him. Hypersensitivity, hypervigilance, overreacting to ambiguous situations and interpreting them automatically as being a form of rejection. And this one of the things that happens. Whole range of it changes the way we think about the world. The rejection process does. Now, I think I'll just skip over this, but the one point that I want to make about this is, well, I've already mentioned to you copers. So copers are people who, even though they've experienced significant rejection, emotionally don't respond exactly the way that I've been describing up to this point. With all the anger, anxiety, and insecurity, emotional unresponsiveness, and so that cluster of 7 to 10 things, they hurt. They're there. These things are important in their lives. These hurtful things, these hurtful experiences, these emotions and whatnot, they're there. But they're not there to the same extent that they are with most rejected people. They're not as psychologically healthy as a person who was raised with love, but they're not as damaged, as it were, as most people who had been rejected. But there's a group up here called troubled, and that's the one that I want to... So by the way, so what I've been talking about is so far as personality subtheory is that as rejection increases, your experiences of rejection intensify, then psychological maladjustment tends to go up. Psychological maladjustment is defined here in terms of that core cluster of 7 to 10 things. That's in PAR theory, that's what we mean by maladjustment or adjustment. Where do you fall collectively on these 7 to 10 things? But troubled. You and I can be psychologically distressed for a whole lot of reasons that have nothing to do with being rejected. So I don't want you to walk out and think that every person who is psychologically distressed or has maladjustment issues and whatnot has necessarily been rejected. That isn't the case. But what concerned me years ago was there are some people that, some adults in particular, that had experienced a lot of acceptance in their childhood by their mothers and their fathers, but they showed the same constellation of psychological problems that I've been describing for the rejected child. Why? The theory says that, this cluster of stuff is a result of the rejection process. Why are those people who had been loved showing the same thing? Then one day a light bulb went off in my head. I was sitting in my office, and across the table from me was one of my colleagues. And she was absolutely distraught about a relationship that failed 3 years earlier. And she was angry, and she blamed herself, so impaired self-esteem. She felt that she was no good in relationships and going on other kinds of things, impaired self-adequacy. And I found myself with my hand under the table as she was talking, ticking off the 7 to 10 things that we know to be true of the rejected child. And they were all there for her. But I knew that she had gone to school with my son. She had gone to high school with my son. So I thought I knew something about her, and I thought that she had come from a loving family. I was pretty sure that she had come from a loving family. And it was at that moment where this light bulb went off in my head, kind of obvious now. Oh, of course, it isn't just parental rejection that has these effects on people. It's rejection at any time in our life by a significant person, an attachment figure. And this guy that dumped her, just one day dumped her, and apparently in a very harsh way, just said, "Get out of my life." And she was passionately in love with him. And so 3 years later, she was still struggling with this. Rejection at any point in our lives by attachment figures can have exactly the same, or is likely to have exactly the same effects that rejection does on children. Usually not to the same extent, not as intensely, and not for as long, because by the time we've become adults, we've had so many other life experiences, and we've become a mature person in ways that young children are not yet able to be. So it doesn't necessarily have, it's not likely to have as powerful an impact, but it's there. So that was the hypothesis that I had. This was about, I don't know, like 10 years ago, something like that. And it was at that point where I realized that I needed to change the name, no longer call it PAR theory, parental acceptance rejection theory, but it needed to be called interpersonal acceptance rejection theory, because it's true for interpersonal relationships, primary relationships, attachment relationships throughout our life. I didn't change the name. We still call it PAR theory, mostly because the label PAR theory is so well known internationally that if I change the label, then people are going to get confused and say, "Well, what's going on here anyway? Is there a new theory out there or something?" No, it's not a new theory. It's the old theory. It's the same theory that's now expanded to include attachment relationships throughout the lifespan. Now, it turns out that this cluster of hurtful things that we've been describing, and I call it very often the rejection or acceptance rejection syndrome, is once you get the rejection process going in childhood and into adolescence and whatnot, it tends to become, and this, by the way, is universally true. We now know that that depression, that rejection is associated, it spins out into depression and depressed affect. Not bipolar depression, because that has a heritability component to it, but unipolar depression. Conduct problems, behavior, the whole range of things, conduct problems, behavior disorders, delinquency, adult criminality, these behavioral kinds of things, rejection tends to be associated with that. The people that I've worked with, former students and whatnot, a prison warden said that every single person, in fact two of them, one in female prison, one in male prison, he said virtually every person there in prison had come from a rejecting background in some way. Well, true or not, I don't know, because it was anecdotal. Substance abuse, drug and alcohol. So in other words, what's happening here is that the rejection process tends to lead people off into a different pathway in life. So now, those of you who work with people, with kids, with adolescents, with adults, if you find a client, a person that you're working with who displays this cluster of personality things that we've been talking about, the anger, self-esteem, and whatnot, that whole cluster, you've got good reason for thinking that that person has experienced some serious rejection at some point. You may want to find out about that. On the other hand, if you work with somebody who you know or informs you has been rejected, then, and you're working, let's say, as a clinician, then you're way ahead of the game, because you know what that person is feeling inside. And we found that I'm not a clinician, but I work with clinicians a great deal. And the clinicians that I work with say that they can save themselves 6 weeks or more of in intake and other kinds of things by knowing about PAR theory, and they know what their clients are likely to be experiencing, and even better than sometimes the clients themselves know at first, and can jump in there and begin to do something about it. I wish I had more time, because what I'd want to say is I want to go on and say, well, some people really want to focus on self-esteem. Well, that's very admirable, but self-esteem by itself isn't going to do it. Some clinicians will focus on certain particular features here, or anger management. Well, that's fine, but anger management by itself won't do it, because what we've got here is a cluster of stuff, like a can of worms that are all tied up with each other. So we've got to start working with all of these things. Another lesson that we've learned is that when we started looking at these things, depression, substance abuse, behavior problems, we need to start looking at fathers. There's a tendency to do what we call mother bashing in clinics and in schools and whatnot. If the kid is showing some sort of behavior problem, there's a tendency, at least in the United States, and I understand it's pretty widespread throughout Europe and perhaps here in Portugal, to blame mom. What did mom do that was wrong to cause this problem? Well, that's the wrong questions, it turns out, because as we now know, and some of you are familiar with the International Father Acceptance-Rejection project that we've been doing, and that Francisco and Marcia and have been working on here in Portugal, we now know that children's experiences with their fathers is as predictive, and sometimes more predictive, than their experiences with mothers. And in fact, sometimes their experiences with mothers drop out altogether, and it's exclusively dad's influence. And unfortunately, it turns out that these three things, at least dads worldwide, tend to be more implicated than moms in the development of it. So you've got to start asking about is there a man in this child's life, or is there a man in this person's life, a father figure, and what's their relationship like? Don't focus just on moms. And then there's so that's going to be lecture number 23 down in my 14 weeks. We spend a great deal of time talking about fathers. Now, I've been focusing a lot on negativity, so let's get a little positive just for a moment here. I'm going to come back to negativity, but by the way, the reason that I focus a lot on negativity is that if we know that a person has been rejected, that fact by itself is a better predictor of outcome than knowing that someone has been accepted. Someone who's been accepted can be psychologically distressed for a whole lot of reasons, having nothing to do with acceptance rejection. If a person is rejected, you know that there's going to be some serious problems with psychological maladjustment and some of these other things. So it's a better predictor of outcome. Now, kids that are raised with love, they tend to be more generous, helpful, empathic, and a whole range of other things that we call pro-social behavior. If you want your child to manifest issues of pro-social behavior, you got to show them. They've got to feel, regardless of what you think you're showing them, they have to feel that you care about them, you want them, you appreciate them, you love them. Starting at very early ages, this needs to be done. Teachers need to take this into account with their pupils and students. Positive peer relationships in adolescence. Overall, a sense of well-being in adulthood. By the way, here's something where dads show up again. Adults' remembrances of their father's love is a better predictor than moms, the adult's remembrance of mom's love, about the adult's sense of happiness, well-being, and such things as that. Some of these gender differences we're working on now, we're trying to figure out, well, exactly what's going on and why are these gender differences there. We have part of the answer, we think, but not completely. And overall, the experience of love is a buffer against just about all of the negative things that we've been talking about. Now back to, and I'm getting signals from my wife that I'm going to have to shut up here. See, I'm a professors are supposed to profess. So you get me talking on this, and I'll go on indefinitely until you shut me up or walk out. So I'll try to end. I'll try to end this. How much time do I have, by the way? How am I doing?
I was completely distracted by what you were saying. You have about 10 minutes.
Oh, 5. My wife says 5. I'm gonna believe Marcia. I like Marcia's. I like Marcia's response better. She says I have 10. Okay. All right. Here's the thing. This issue of rejection. Some psychologists used to tell me, they used to sort of snort at me a little bit and say, it's just an epiphenomenon, it's just feeling, it's not real and stuff like that. Well, we now have evidence that in fact, the rejection process has measurable biochemical and neurobiological implications. It changes the structure of our brain. That we talk about it hurts. You know, you're in love with somebody and that relationship's not going very well. And you say, God, it hurts. I want her with me, or him. Well, the hurt is real because as it turns out, rejection lights up exactly the same part of the brain that physical pain does. It hurts, and you feel it. It's in the brain. Now, the thing about emotional hurt, though, is that you and I, we can relive this hurt time and time and time again. Every time we remember it, it can hurt. Now, physical pain is different. You cannot feel the physical pain again. You can remember that you hurt, but you don't feel the pain. But emotional pain, wow, it can haunt you forever. The emotional pain can bully you throughout the rest of your life, remembering it. There's something peculiar in the brain structure, but the rejection process also changes if it's long-term serious rejection. It changes the structure of the brain. The brain structure of long-term rejected children is different, measurably different from the brain structure of kids that are raised with love. And it goes on. It all kinds of neurobiological, biomedical things. Here's some of the effects of long-term effects going on into adulthood of the experiences of rejection from childhood. It's greater susceptibility to a whole range of medical problems. This issue of love, of being cared about or not cared about, spins out in all aspects of our life in ways that no other human phenomena that I am personally aware of does. It's that fundamental in what we are and what we become as human beings, and that's why we need to pay attention to it. If we really want to understand the people that we're working with, the people that we're with, or to understand ourselves, because I'm talking to you, I'm hoping that you're thinking about yourself and that you find yourself in virtually everything that I've been talking about today in some way. So, physical health benefits. I want to talk about, this is now the work of another person that I admire greatly, and it's the work of Corey Floyd in affection exchange theory. And what Corey has found is that, see, I've been talking about the experiences of love. Experiencing it from somebody else and feeling that it's there. What Corey is doing is he's talking about expressing love, expressing affection. And what he has found, he and his colleagues have found, is that reaching out and expressing affection to other people has benefits. Health, psychological benefits over and above all the other benefits that you get from receiving love. The message is reach out to folks. You're going to benefit from it, as well as the person. So you're in a relationship, or you're not even in a relationship. You can reach out to somebody and touch them in a loving way. You've got to be careful about some of these things. They can be misunderstood. I know, I experiment and stuff like that. Sometimes in the past I've gotten into trouble and stuff like that. But anyway, I'm trying to learn what are the boundaries on expressing affection that are appropriate. So giving love, giving affection, and receiving it. Two very powerful experiences in our life. So here are some of the psychological benefits of giving love to somebody. And I want to, those of you who are interested in pursuing my topic, our topic here, I invite you to take a look at the website that we have listed here. Now, if you will do me a favor, I want everybody in the room to stand up and to hug somebody next to you. Come on, come on. Stand up, everybody.
Thank you so much.
All right. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Hugs Rohner now.
You see, I get to hug and kiss my wife.
I told you at the beginning that I was completely useless at this, and this was one of the reasons my job here was to keep track of time and tell Ron when his time was up, and I completely forgot it because I was so interested in what he had to say. So thank you, Nancy, because I really am completely useless at this. I have other talents, but not this one. So thank you so much, Ron, for this lovely presentation. And now I wanted to, as our friend Sofia Neves usually say, pass the ball on to you. So whatever questions you want to make and whatever comments you want to make, you'd be more than welcome to make them now.
Just one remark. You can make your questions in Portuguese, then we'll translate it
translate them.
to Ron. Or if you like, you can practice your English. So it's just one thing. Students, especially master students, must do their questions in English. Okay? They need the practice. No, I'm joking. You can do it in Portuguese.
Go ahead.
Do we have a microphone? We're going to get a microphone so we can hear you.
Eu não devia fazer isto, mas faço sempre.
First of all, great presentation, I liked it. But I feel that part theory focuses on figures of attachment. And I would like to know what it has to say about our peers. You know, because I heard a lot about children and adults, and I was thinking, what about adolescents, when we have our first relations with our peers that are more significant to us? So I feel that That's one question I want to pose. What about our peers that are not our attachment figures, but our peers in general?
Am I still coming through okay here? Okay. Yeah, no, peer relationships are obviously very important. Especially the kind of peer relationships where you're talking about best friends. We generally, we don't, in par theory, this may be a limitation, I'm not sure, we generally don't deal with a large group of people called peers per se. We usually focus on relationships. And we know how powerful relationships are. We also know how powerful peer relationships are. And in some of the sociometric studies that are done of peer relationships, those people who are marginalized by their peers, even though, well, I say marginalized by their peers do hurt. But what we don't know is, from a par theory perspective, and this is a study that needs to be done, if they're marginalized by their peers or rejected by their peers or something by a group, is it the fact that the whole group or some portion of the group that's so hurtful, or is it the fact that certain individuals within that group are the ones that are also part of it, you know, that are making you feel like you're rejected or unwanted or whatever that might be. You've just you've just opened up your own thesis topic.
Anyone else? Just let me make a bit of personal advertising. And we have 2 studies about peer relationships and acceptance rejection here by our students. That is Tiago. I was looking for you just when Pedro asked his question because I wanted to point you out. And Nono, wherever he is. Nono?
He's occupied doing something for the symposium.
So he disappeared. So
But he
Nuno
was here.
Batista and Tiago Pimenta have done their thesis on it, so you can exchange notes on that. Okay. Tiago will present. Oh, Tiago will present his paper. His paper. I'm thinking ahead. His thesis in the afternoon, so you can exchange that.
Hello, good morning. First of all, thank you for your words. I think we've learned a lot today. I would like to pose a question regarding the copers category, and I would like to understand a little bit better what variables explain the outcomes of these individuals. I mean, they are not as adjusted as regular acceptant children, but what factors do explain they become copers? Is the acceptance as powerful as rejection? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. That's a very important question. We don't know. That we have a doctoral dissertation underway right now with one of our therapists, Ph.D. students in marriage and family therapy, working on this very issue. The question in our mind, and I think it's probably the same question that you were asking, is what characteristics do copers have that allows them to not respond the way that most people do to the rejection process? In par theory, in coping subtheory, we have some things that we think are working: a sense of self, a greater sense of self, a more differentiated sense of self, and a few other things like that. But we don't know yet. The problem is this: copers are very difficult to find. True copers, in a measurement sense. So, for example, let's say that we have 100 people in our sample. Now there may be 10 of them who are seriously rejected, and maybe 2 of those or 1 of those don't seem to be responding the same way that most people do. So finding that one person or 2 people in a sample of 100, and then working with that person to try to find out what it is what characteristics that person has is difficult and very time consuming. But that's what we have to do. In order to understand the coping process, we have to find those people and get them willing to be interviewed and measured in the other ways that we do. And we're in the process of working on that right now. But at the moment, we don't have any clear answers. If you ask me that in a year from now, I hope I'll be able to say, oh yes, of course, we have a good idea of what's going on. Because it's absolutely essential that we can find out. As I mentioned earlier, if you're working with people in a clinical setting or any other kind of setting where you're trying to intervene or you're trying to bring about a change in human life, it's essential that we have some good evidence about what it is what kinds of things do we have to work on in order to bring positive change into people's life as a result of their own experiences of rejection. We know that. We just don't know yet how to go about doing it. Many people don't want to try to go into the coping process because it does take time and it's very labor intensive. So they, for doctoral dissertations and whatnot, they want to be able to get something that's faster, and it's understandable. You want to get out and get on with the rest of your life. So it's the rest of us who are getting on with the rest of our lives in our professions that we may have more time to do that, except for this one student that has chosen as her life's work to try to understand the coping process. Please don't feel intimidated by all the things that I've said. It's a lifetime of work. For all that we know now, there is vastly more that we don't know. Every time we do a study, we open up whole new sets of questions that need to be answered. So in my lifetime, even though I've been working on it for well over half a century now, I regard this as only scratching the surface. We know an enormous amount about it, but it's going to be up to you all to pursue this and be able to answer some of the other fundamental questions that are still out there, yet to be asked and certainly yet to be answered.
I'm not very well in speaking English, so I make my question in Portuguese. So Francisco, if you please translate my question. I'm going to talk about perceived acceptance. Sim. Eu queria falar por causa de as crianças que têm afeto enquanto sua infância e a sua adolescência, e depois, quando são introduzidas numa sociedade que hoje não está aberta a isso, portanto, não há aquele pai que tem tempo para descascar a laranja e dar gomo à sua criança. Essas crianças que são amadas pelos seus familiares, pela sua família nuclear, não são aceites muitas vezes pelos seus pares. E então era exatamente que não existe esse registro de amor e aceitação. Portanto, eu gostava de saber o que é que o Sr. Ronald...
Ron, she's asking. She's focusing on the accepted kids. They are that are loved by their parents and family members, and then they go to the society in general, in schools and other contexts, but they go to environments where frequently they don't get accepted by their peers because their peers are not used to be accepted. They tend to be rejected. So how can they? Her question relates to how can they adjust to a rejecting world, rejecting peers. When they are in their home, in their base, they are accepted kids, loved kids.
That's a very complicated question, isn't it? You know, actually what I'm going to have to do in this case is say, I don't know. Because I've never worked, and keep in mind, PAR theory is an evidence-based theory. So I'm not inclined to speculate too far about things. I'll develop some ideas, some hypotheses and whatnot, but in this case, I've never encountered children who come from loving families that are put in a rejecting environment, rejecting peers per se. I mean, I just don't know. It really just depends, I think, on the context and who the peers are and why they're being rejected. I mean, for example, is it a gang? I need much more information before I could even begin, I think, to speculate in any responsible way about that. I'm sorry. So it's the best. I don't know. So the bottom line is, I don't know. I don't know.
She was talking about specifically. She was talking about children that are accepted, being interacting with children whose families don't have the time and the emotional availability to give those pieces of orange to their kids' mouths. So she's talking about the families that don't have the time to interact or to have activities that can promote positive and loving and accepting behavior. And when they go to the same social context, they have different behavioral patterns. So one is more loving and tries to express that love, that acceptance to his peers, his or her peers, and as the other kids are not used to that kind of behavior from their primary family context, they don't respond that well, or they don't know how to respond to those kids that have the habit of expressing love and affection.
So was there a question in that?
It was just to clarify the context part
Okay.
of the question.
Yeah.
Because you went in the way of the gangs, and I was correcting because I feared I didn't explain it all that well.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to ask your opinion about how is the better way to work with children and teenagers with rejection problems. How a professional can work with them.
How can professionals work with rejected children effectively? Are we talking now about in a clinical setting, or are we talking in a school setting? What setting do you have in mind?
School setting. School. Educational setting.
Okay. Well, probably the first thing that you have to keep in mind is that the behaviors and probably the misbehavior of these kids, or the tendency toward misbehaving in some way, is something that you would expect to have happen. So you don't want to start calling these kids bad kids and all the other negative baggage that tends to go with that. The blaming. These kids are not to be, these kids are not to be blamed. They are responsible, of course, for their behavior. And they need to know that behavior has costs. Uh, and they need to be, you know, that in mind. They need to be kept in line in some way, but not to be blamed for these things. Try to work with them to understand that what else is going on within them psychologically and within their families. Very often, what some people are finding very helpful, if it can be done, is to get the parents involved in a caring way, because sometimes it's the fact that you know, it's the parents that seem to be indifferent or hostile or on drugs or alcohol or, you know, things like that. So it's very difficult to work with the kids who no matter what you do in the school, it seems like they go back to that home, they're in the same environment, and then they come back to school again, and they kind of start all over again. I don't know of any program right now that has really effectively dealt with that kind of issue, although I understand that there are programs that are quite good, but I just personally haven't had the time to follow up on those.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I have asked to you if a particular stressful event, a death of a nuclear family member during the childhood or adolescence, can alter the acceptance perception, even if that persons were feeling loved till that date, since there is a connection between religion and our parents. I don't know if you understood the question.
Someone has been accepted, but loses someone in their close family ties. So if the parent dies, does that change the perceived acceptance or rejection? And how is it connected to religion or religion?
Yeah, sometimes, by the way, with death in a family, even you felt loved by the parent. The parent dies, and sometimes it happens that you blame the parent for leaving you, and it has some of the same effects sometimes as the rejection process. In other words, the angry that the person. And by the way, it also happens in love relationships. If a spouse dies, sometimes there's blaming the spouse, angry at the spouse. Why did you leave me? It's your fault, and so forth. So, if you're going to try to deal with that, you need to understand that this is a phenomenon that is very possible to happen, not that it's likely to happen. And then you try to deal with it as in the usual way of that you would work with rejection. By the way, I should point out that those of you who are in the clinical sphere, what we have found is that some of you are familiar with the parental acceptance rejection questionnaire and the intimate adult relationship questionnaire, two questionnaires that we've designed to be used internationally. And some clinicians are using these measures in clinical context, having the people respond to them and then going over them one item by item, and also the personality assessment questionnaire that gets at these personality characteristics of anger and self-esteem and so forth, and going over them with the client, and it's trying to get the client's perspective about how did you feel about that particular, my mother hits me even though I don't deserve it, is one of the items perhaps. Well, what happened? Give me an illustration of this in context. And they find that people who are with these kinds of questions have something in front of them. The clinician knows what each one of these items is trying to get to and whatnot. They find that it's been very helpful in allowing people to focus their attention on things that we know are related to the experiences of rejection. So it doesn't go off track. Both in terms of their experiences of acceptance rejection and also their personality things. Keeps people on track in an interesting way because it's their responses. So you said it's almost always true. You responded that way to the item, my mother hits me even though I don't deserve it. Almost always true. That's okay, that's interesting. Give me an illustration of how this happens. When did that happen? And so forth. And you can, we found, we did a doctoral dissertation several years ago with one of our clinicians. And she found that she could get through the therapeutic process about 4 or 5 weeks faster, or 6 weeks faster, using this technique. More complicated than what I'm describing now, more organized and whatnot, than the conventional approach that was used in this case in marriage and family therapy. It was couples, working with couples. And working with couples, asking each member of the couple, they're together, the male and the female, the husband and the wife are male and female partners, they're together, and they're listening to what their partner is saying about their life experiences. And the rule is, let's say the wife or the woman is talking about her relationship with her mothers and fathers and her feelings about her relationships with her partner. Now, the rule is that the guy can't say anything, he can't contradict her in this context. These are her feelings. And it's important that you listen to her feelings about what went on. And very often the clinician said, the other partner said, I had no idea that you felt that way. I had no idea that you experienced this. And it worked enormously well. Now, I haven't seen it being used clinically with children in the same way, because the program that we have at the University of Connecticut is marriage and family therapy, so it's mainly couples or individual adults more than children. But I'd love to have somebody use this approach with kids, because it should be usable in all kinds of contexts. I'm answering a question that you didn't even ask, but you know.